This city is the
Yeah.
confluence of the Assiniboine and Red Rivers, and
Yes,
it
Richard.
has been a
Fab.
gathering site for Indigenous nations
Got
since
their name.
time immemorial. Treaty 1 signatory nations include Cree, Anishinaabeg, Ojibwe, and Nakota First Nations. Manitoba is also part of the Métis Nation homeland, which stretches across the northern Great Plains and into the subarctic boreal forest. Now, it's common in Canada for people to open talks with land acknowledgements like the one I've just given. These statements were originally meant to cause people to reflect on the reality that in North America, all land is Indigenous land. Unfortunately, many land acknowledgements have become boilerplate. They're rote phrases to tick a box in the diversity and inclusion column. So I like to open by also highlighting Indigenous initiatives and offering audiences the opportunity to take some meaningful action towards decolonization or reconciliation. Today, I want to highlight the Bear Clan Patrol, which is a community-led harm reduction initiative that began here in Winnipeg and has now spread to most cities in the prairies. I'd also like to draw your attention to the Bistro Lake Indigenous Protected and Conserved Area Initiative. Indigenous peoples globally protect more than 80% of our planet's biodiversity, and IPCAs are among some of the strongest ways we're doing it here. If you or your family have benefited from resource extraction or settler colonialism, these are just a couple ways that you could re-examine and begin to repair that relationship. I use the word relationship deliberately. Relationships are foundational to Indigenous worldviews. We honor relationships with people, with place, and with all life around us. Our relationships are also the foundations of our identities. Nitsigasun as Klymiuk, Nahia o Tepimsiwao e Aqueo. I am an other-gendered Cree and Métis person, and I also acknowledge descent from regions of Eastern Europe that today are recognized as Ukraine. I am a citizen of the Métis Nation of Alberta, and I have family connections to Satellite Goodfish Lake First Nation in Treaty 6 territory. I grew up here, near the confluence of the Peace and the Notikewin rivers in northern Alberta. These are my relations, and I also hold kinship with knowledge, because knowledge is a living thing that we are responsible to care for and to pass forward. I began today's talk by sharing my positionality. In the culture of Western science, we like to say that science is the investigation of the self-evident. We like to pretend that who we are as people has no bearing on the ways in which we conduct our research or present our findings. Let me paraphrase Goethe, who said, "The eye which the mind brings means of seeing." Western science has this pervasive mythos of impartiality, of being disinterested and disconnected observers. And so we are constantly surprised that facial recognition software misinterprets dark skin, or that mice react more to aerosolized testosterone of predominantly male technicians than they do to experimental variables. Perhaps we would be less surprised if we stepped back and recognized that we are all subtly and not so subtly shaped by the cultures we're steeped in and the dominant socioeconomic paradigms in which we conduct our lives. Perhaps a good place to start with this is a culture shift in biosciences education. I don't have all the answers. Perhaps I don't have any. What I do have is a large undergraduate mycology course at a U15 research university, and today I'm going to talk about some of the decisions I've made in redesigning this program and the ways I've chosen to engage multidisciplinary learners. Before I start talking about decolonization or Indigenous approaches to education, however, I need to provide some context on the history of colonization in Canada, because it was under the guise of education that the settler colonial state of Canada practiced genocide upon Indigenous peoples. Let's begin in the 1450s with the doctrine of discovery. This was the foundation upon which European imperialism was built. This includes King Charles II's Royal Charter of 1670, which formed the world's oldest multinational corporation, the Hudson's Bay Company. For 193 years, the HBC functioned as a government. Its governor generally had the powers of viceroyalty throughout the Hudson's Bay watershed. In 1821, the HBC amalgamated with the Northwest Company, expanding their extractive jurisdiction across the continent. In 1870, jurisdiction over Rupert's Land was transferred to the Government of Canada, which in 1876 enacted the Indian Act, asserting authority of the federal government over Indigenous peoples. 7 years later, the Government of Canada formally initiated the Indian Residential Schools program in collaboration with the Catholic and United Anglican churches. The explicit purpose of these schools was to strip Indigenous children of their families, languages, and cultures, to forcibly assimilate them into white European beliefs. Most people will remember 2020 as a time of lockdowns and fear, or perhaps think back in awe and inspiration at how the global scientific community embraced open science. But 2020 was also the year of ground-penetrating radar. In 2015, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission had released a scathing indictment of the atrocities suffered by Indigenous children in these schools. Survivors provided oral testimony that at least 3,200 children were killed at these schools in living memory. It took 5 years and ground-penetrating radar showing unmarked graves for this reality to finally percolate into the collective consciousness of this nation. Children were killed at these schools.
What's that?
Yes, press play again.
Oh, apologies.
Through neglect, starvation, and through diseases like tuberculosis. They were also beaten, tortured, and sexually abused. The last residential school closed in 1996. Survivors continue to suffer the impacts of these schools, and the legacy of violence continues forward as intergenerational trauma. On July 29th, following his pilgrimage to Canada, Pope Francis acknowledged that the residential schools were genocidal. On October 26th of this year, Parliament voted unanimously to formally recognize the residential schools as genocide. Winnipeg is situated in the heart of North America, and the University of Manitoba is home to the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation. This land has been a gathering place for nations since time beyond memory, and today it gathers stories of what has been done to Indigenous peoples in this land. I was recruited to the University of Manitoba as an Indigenous scholar in science. These are positions which form a small part of the university's overarching vision for reconciliation. The history I've shared with you is context for why I care deeply about the work I do as an educator, and why I mindfully engage in this work through the lens of Indigenous values and history. So for example, I record my lectures and I post them online. I don't take attendance. I don't have pop quizzes. I don't have clicker questions. This absolutely does diminish the number of students who show up. But I don't believe that I, as an Indigenous educator, should be creating a learning space where students are prodded and punished into learning content that they don't want to. Forcing information into people's heads is an act of violence. That's not what we're here for. What we're here for, today anyway, is mycology. One of the first 6 science professors hired at was the British mycologist Henry Buller. His contributions include basidiospore discharge mechanisms, work on fungal mating systems, and some truly terrible poetry. A great many mycologists have walked through the building bearing his name, and it is a privilege to be the latest and to introduce our students to the organismal biology of. There's a big problem with fungi, though. We've historically taught them as a second-year survey of diversity course, which works great for plants or animals where morphology broadly corresponds to phylogeny. I spoke earlier about relationality and Indigenous worldviews. In Cree, the word wakotowin encompasses this understanding. It's a verb for being in relationship with one another. When we speak of all our relations, we understand kinship as more than strict phylogenetic or biological relatedness. Although I will point out, fungi are opisthocons, and thus they are more closely related to Animalia than all other eukaryotes. They're cousins, if you will. In our cosmologies, kinship also encompasses land, not just other than human living beings. If you're wondering how you can be related to land, I'd like to invite you to think about carbon and nitrogen cycling, to reflect on the plant and animal bodies that you consume to build your own tissues, and how your own body will eventually pass back to land. Or you can consider adenosine triphosphate, the functional unit in cellular energy equations. It's largely fungi that are responsible for mobilizing phosphorus in terrestrial environments. I titled this talk Meeting Fungal Kin. As Indigenous people, when we're meeting someone, one of the very first questions we'll be asked is, where are you from? Which nation? Which families? Which land? Who are you related to? How are we kin? Dobzhansky famously said that nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. And it sure would be nice to teach fungal diversity in a wholly phylogenetic framework, who they're related to. The trouble is, fungi evolved in a chemical landscape with compounds like lignin and hemicellulose, and in competition with other microbes. Morphological features like fungal fruiting bodies are highly convergent, evolutionarily meaningless in most cases. This has been evident for decades, so we've historically looked to cellular features like basidia, the cells that produce sexual spores. There are several morphological categories for basidia, and they're frequently used to define taxonomy, incorrectly, as it transpires. The availability of genome-based phylogenies has created some distinct challenges in teaching these organisms at an introductory level. Take the gliophylales, for instance. This is literally a slide from one of my diversity lectures. For fungi, morphology can be diagnostic, but it very rarely reflects phylogeny. So how do I teach this to more than 200 undergraduates, many of whom are not majoring in biological sciences? And how do I teach it in a way that reflects an Indigenous perspective, since I happen to be occupying this space as an Indigenous person? One option, of course, is to disregard taxonomy and focus on charismatic taxa. This is the kind of trivia-heavy course that my students expected based on precedents. Now, considering the role of the railroads in Canadian history, I do have a certain fondness for neo-Lentinists here. But a focus on individual taxa too quickly becomes a focus on their utility. There is indeed interest in fungi in terms of bioprospecting, remediation, even as alternative fabrication materials. But asking how are they useful to us is, from my perspective, exploitative and disrespectful. We don't learn who our relatives are by asking what they'll do for us. Beyond the onus of acting in good relation to kin, which is implicit in Wakotuan and Miawachedowin as verbs, I also bring a particular paradigm to how I think about fungi. I'm privileged to keep some knowledge about medicinal plants, which are conceptualized as sacred gifts. Not only do we curate knowledge of how to collect and use plants, we are also responsible for harvesting them in ways that maintain their populations and environments. If I teach you a medicinal plant, I teach you everything I know about that plant, from its phenology to ecology, because in giving you the knowledge of how to use it, I am also responsible for teaching you how to care for it. Fungi are literally sources of medicine. From antibiotics to statins to immunosuppressants, they have transformed human health. So I fundamentally disagree with trivializing fungal kin or viewing them through a lens of utility. I keep the taxonomy and phylogeny, but a lot of my focus is on organismal biology, everything from life cycles to how clamp connections and semi-closed mitosis maintain the dikaryotic state. While this satisfies me that I'm teaching these organisms in a respectful way, it is probably less than thrilling for the students who enrolled wanting to learn about the Wood Wide Web or how to identify edible mushrooms. Thus, I chose to distribute 40% of the course weight to projects that engage students in experiential learning, that teach academic skills, and that integrate art with science. Experiential learning is intrinsic to Indigenous philosophies of education. It's literally learning by doing. I gave my students some guides and sent them out to the woods to learn basidiocarps. This is self-directed, land-based learning. Students were responsible for photographing and identifying 5 different fungi, which they assembled into PowerPoints and labeled with taxonomy, classification, and diagnostic features. I even had them poke around on Mycobank to find citations for the original species descriptions. They gained practical experience with terminology, dichotomous keys, guidebooks, and they quickly mastered taking informative photos. These are all skills that they'll carry forward. Another project in this course asked students to begin navigating primary literature. Although we do read some papers in class, for many students, these annotated bibliographies were their first independent experience finding and reading scientific studies. One of my learning outcomes for this project was to reinforce writing hygiene by requiring in-text citations. And this project was a good reminder for me that education is a dialogue. As I was grading, I discovered a sizable number did not understand in-text citations, and they had inadvertently plagiarized. So I pivoted course content, and I spent a lecture teaching this topic. Learner-centered education is responsive, meeting students where they're at. I also brought perspectives of Indigenous justice, restorative justice to this. Instead of penalizing students, I offered them an opportunity to correct their work and resubmit for full marks. Reading and compiling literature built directly into their final project, which comprised a literature review and accompanying creative translation of scientific knowledge that they'd gained. So these ran the gamut of YouTube videos to paintings, dioramas, posters, even poetry, and these were displayed in a gallery session open to the department. Most students responded with incredible enthusiasm. Most is an important word. Manitoba has a high Indigenous population relative to other Canadian provinces. Only 13% of Manitobans say they hold very favorable views of Indigenous people. When I'm standing at my lectern, I'm conscious that I embody Indigenous representation in the academy. The course I've redesigned used to be taught as an easy A. Some students have been very upset when I introduced rigor. Indigenous people continue to face intolerance and indifference, and I am constantly aware that my choices may contribute to making things worse. Perhaps my net impact will be positive. I guess we'll find out. I want to end with something I hope will have net positive effects in your own teaching. I want to offer a gentle reminder that we should be intentional in the way we use language. The word colonization itself is heavily used in botany and mycology. Fungi colonize plant roots, and plants colonize the land with aid of fungal partners. Using this word implies that colonization is somehow neutral or even beneficial. But this Western framing muddies how we understand biology. Fungi are not out there committing genocide in plant roots. They're just inhabiting them, sometimes eliciting a host response, sometimes not. And plants didn't colonize land moving to terra firma from somewhere else. They almost certainly evolved in fully terrestrialized settings from soil-dwelling Zygnematalian green algae. I hope you'll agree with me that words matter. Decolonization is a word that I see continuously co-opted and robbed of its meaning. Occasionally it stands in for inclusion of Indigenous peoples, but more often it's used interchangeably with a variety of EDI phrases. But to truly decolonize is to give back the rights, dignities, and resources that were taken in colonial enterprises, to restore languages, knowledges, and systems of justice and values. So how will you decolonize? Thank you.